Hello, this is Tony Blazer for the Motocross Vault presented by Blinzall. If you're in the market for some high-quality racing oil for your two-stroke or four, make sure you go to blinzall.com and use our discount code VAULT20 to save 20% at checkout. Thank you for all the support.
This is Hannah. This is Bailey. Welcome to the Motocross Vaults.
Hello and welcome back to the Motocross Vault. My name is Tony Blazer, and what this video is going to cover is a look back at one of the most iconic and beloved off-road machines of the last 50 years, Honda's XR200. Started in 1979 actually as a 185. The XR200 would go on through Honda's lineup till 2002. It was a really great machine. It's a machine I owned as a younger person, I guess maybe a teenager. It really was one of the machines actually I first took and kind of learned how to ride on a motocross track on, which is funny as that seems. Before the XR200, I'd had a CR250, but I was really just riding it, around my house up and down the driveway and stuff. Didn't really know. We ended up moving somewhere, and then there was a homemade motocross track available, and I ended up picking up an XR200, and it kind of taught me the basics. It was a really great, fun machine. Obviously, they're not very fast, but it was a good learning bike. And I think that's what they're most known for. They're great, first machines, great machines for someone who's not a hardcore enthusiast. And I love riding them anyway, just because they're just fun. They're you can pin them everywhere. They're very light. They're surprisingly light for a four-stroke. And especially early on in the 80s, they were really fun little interesting machines. They went through several different iterations over the years. At one point, Honda decided to try and make them a little more like a hardcore enduro bike, which, let's be honest, none of the XRs were, except maybe the XR600. Just they had enough displacement to be powerful enough to be legitimate. Even then, it always seemed like more of a desert bike. Guys like Scott Summers, I don't know how they went so fast in the woods, but these XRs, they were much better as a play bike, I think, or a kind of a light enduro racer than any serious, like a two-stroke, like a KTM or a Husqvarna at the time. This machine, as I said, went through several iterations, and what this video is going to do is I'm just going to go from the beginning in 79 until the end in 2002. I'm going to go year by year. In the 90s, really, there wasn't much. There's really only one change of any significance they made in the 90s, and then it was just bold new graphics and stuff like that after that. But I'll show you what each one looked like. Get into a little bit. If there's a year where there's significant change, we'll get into that. If there's not, we'll probably go pretty quick. So in any case, if you like this sort of thing, I've also done a very similar article for the XR250 and the XR500. I'm a big fan of XRs, as I said in the past. I think they're awesome machines, and you can find them on my channel. If you'd like to support what I do, I actually just came out with an XR design for one of my shirts. I've had several people ask for like off-road style stuff, so I've came out with a one based on the 1985 XRs, probably my favorite color combo of all time. I love the 85 Hondas, the orangey red with the blue seat and stuff. Just an iconic look. I love it. And the XRs this year were really great looking. The XR350 and 600 were really, really good looking machines. So if you want to check that out, the link will be in the description below. If you'd like to share, subscribe, put it out on social media, I would very much appreciate that. If you leave a comment, I always read the comments, so if there's a particular model you'd like to see me do in the future, leave a comment below and I'll try and address that if I have the brochures and the magazines and what have you to get the information. I always got a bunch of them in the hopper. It's always a slow process. It takes me a while to put these together. So in any case, here's the story of the Honda XR200R. The XR200 story starts here in 1979 with the introduction of the all-new XR185. Now, this machine was completely new from the ground up. Now, the motor itself, though, did have its roots going back to maybe a decade or so to the original SL Hondas of the early 70s. They also had produced an XL175 from 1973 until 1978. And this motor is based largely on the XL with some fairly significant differences. Clearly, this is an off-road only motor. It does not have the full normal battery setup that a street bike would have. It used a capacitor discharge ignition, which was lighter weight, simpler. And of course, the frame is all new. The chassis is completely new. Now, in 1979 here, Honda introduced three full-size XRs. They had an XR75 since 73, and that was really the first XR, kind of actually Honda's first serious off-road bike of any kind, to be honest. It actually predates the CR by a few months, and that XR75 was a legitimate mini racer for many years in the 70s. But this XR was designed to be an enduro class machine. At the time, there was a 200 and below class, machines like the KDX 175, IT 175, Can-Am 175. They all kind of played in that realm. And this XR was designed to kind of compete with them. Although a lot of people would tell you The real competition was probably more bikes like the KD175, the DS185 from Suzuki, or the MX175 Yamaha. Those bikes were, lightweight, two-stroke play bikes. Machines like the KDX and the IT, they were just really, none of those bikes are like holy crap powerhouses, but they were in a class above the XR in terms of performance. Honda did try to market this first XR as a, legitimate quote-unquote enduro racer. As I said, I had the 1980 model, and it was a fun bike. I wouldn't characterize it as much of a race bike though. But there are interesting features on this first 185. It used a 2-valve, 180.2cc motor, very simple, rugged engine. There really is only 2 areas that cause problems on these motors. The kickstart gears are weak, and if you don't keep them in proper adjustment, they will go bad. That's a common problem on these things. And the transmissions, if you, as I said, I had issues with my transmission. It was a well-known thing. If you're hard on this thing, you could damage the transmission. But for the most part, if you kept the oil fresh on these motors, they're pretty bulletproof overall. And this motor did not change a lot up until the bike that it was retired in 2002. It did get a little bump in displacement, and went a little different route for a couple years there on the XRs. But overall, this was a great engine, and Honda used it for 40 years, more or less. It was also a very similar variant was used in the first ATC 200X, and then the old ATC 185 used a very similar engine to this as well. Great motor design. Now, interesting, this first 1979 model did not get the 23-inch front wheel that was put on the 250 and the 500. Now, Honda had kind of experimented with a larger wheel that year on the CR125 and a couple of the XRs. I think the XLs got it as well, which is their dual sport variant. And that was designed to, they thought it would follow the train a little better. It wouldn't fall into shallows of whoops and what have you. Some people liked it, some people didn't. I never ridden it with them. I can't speak to it myself, but I know a lot of people didn't really care for the feel. It gave it kind of a strange, different feel. It also limited the tire selection somewhat. This first one, pretty cool machine. It has full headlights. You'll see it has a speedometer and odometer. Primary kickstarting. The engine was very quiet. It put out, you had 8.5 inches of travel up front, 7.5 inches of travel in the rear from a pair of dual shocks. Now, if you look at the test at the time, this machine, the suspension was very soft. I can even attribute to that. I was riding it around a motocross track, but it was not really made for that. If you see this thing now, the forks are tiny offerings. They look like they came out of about 1976 or so. They are leading axle, but they're very, very soft. The tests even at the time comment on just how soft the suspension was. So, if you were going to actually try and race this thing, you're probably going to want to get the suspension upgraded. But let's be honest, I don't think too many people were actually thinking about racing an XR185 in 1979. Now, Honda does say in literature they had a power upgrade kit for this thing, which upped the displacement, added a new cylinder and all kinds of stuff. I'm not sure how many people actually invested in that at the time. They turned all kinds of ATC 185s and stuff into rippers, so I'm sure companies like Powroll and stuff could make this thing fast, but I don't think that. I think that's kind of missing the point of this very first version. It really was a great play bike that you could race if you really wanted to. For 1980, the XR was back with a list of fairly minor updates. The basic machine was brand new the year before, so they basically just came back with a few things that were people, I guess, complained about or mentioned the year before. Now, as I mentioned, in 79, you could get a upgrade kit that they kind of claimed would give you another 3 horsepower. It upped the displacement, gave you a different pipe and some other doodads. Now, for 1980, they upped the displacement to the same 15 cc's you would have got in that kit, making the displacement a full 195 cc's. So that doesn't sound like a ton, but on a small motor, 15 cc's is a pretty significant upgrade. Now, this is the bike I actually owned. I owned one of these 1980 model XR200s, and I loved it. It had a really broad power. Obviously, none of these little 4-strokes are going to yank your arms out of your socket, but it was a really good, easy-to-ride engine. It was super fun to ride. I really enjoyed the motor. So I didn't ride the 180cc version, but this 195 one, really torquey and a great little motor. And as I said, Honda would use it more or less the same basic engine for 40 years, so you can tell it was a really good rugged design overall. Now, in addition to upping the displacement for 1980, they made some adjustment to the rear chain adjuster on the back of the swing arm to make it a little easier to adjust and more reliable. They added new dogleg levers with little balls on the end to prevent it from catching on brush and bark, trees, and whatever you might be running into in the woods. Got to remember, this first version didn't have hand guards at all, so these dogleg levers were really nice levers, actually. Honda always used good quality stuff on their bikes. It was a nice little addition. They redesigned the toolkit to have instead of several tools, to like a universal tool with lots of little parts on it to use it for several different things. The 31 millimeter forks were the same as the year before. They did up the spring rate slightly. The forks, these things were pretty soft. They weren't designed for motocross, and even for really fast enduro use, they would have been soft. This bike, clearly, even though they marketed it, as I said, as an enduro machine, it's more of a play bike. So as long as you took it reasonably and you kept your speeds down, it was fine. But if you're going to try and push it, you're going to quickly meet the limits of the stock suspension. Now, the foot pegs, in 1979, the XR185 had used a rubber-mounted foot peg. There was actually a rubber grommet in the mount. Now, this probably has to do with the fact that a lot of the stuff on this XR, as I said, the bike was kind of used an XL, the Enduro version, for a lot of its basis. And things like the rubber-mounted foot pegs and what have you, those are common on like dual sport bikes where you don't want vibration getting to you on a long street ride. This first version also had a cush drive, which is like rubber grommets in the rear wheel. This actually wore out on the one I had. The rubber grommets got a little play, and it would let the wheel rock ever so slightly, and under high stress, it would throw the chain. These are things that common on a street bike. You don't really want them on a dirt bike, but Honda obviously was rating their parts bin with this first XR. So it had some of that stuff. Clearly, rubber-mounted foot pegs, not great for an off-road race bike. So for 1980, they went to a solid metal direct connection for the foot peg. So that was a nice improvement. Other than that, this is really the same bike. Looks the same. All the body works the same. They really didn't, other than the decal on the side plate, you really can't tell the two apart. They're basically identical. They still maintain the claw action tires of 79. This was a tire that Honda developed with, I believe, Bridgestone. And most people did not care much for them, but they came standard on this as well. I think they probably got swapped out by most people pretty quickly. All right, here in 1981, that's where things start getting kind of interesting on the XR200, because you see a split. They have a all-new XR200R, which is completely a new model for 1981, and it adopts Honda's new ProLink rear suspension system. And you got to keep in mind, this is the first year the ProLink was on the CRs as well. So you have your CR480 has this system, and then you get that same basic. Clearly, it's not as high quality of shock on it, but the same basic ProLink is found on this XR200. So that's really cool. I mean, if you're somebody, a young kid like me, you basically get this little XR, and it looks very much like a CR. It's pretty neat. They continue to have the XR200 no R at the end for 1981. And that's interesting in that it's basically the exact same machine they had the year before, with the deletion of the lights. You notice this new XR doesn't have lights on the front or the back, and no toolkit. Still has the old-fashioned looking rear fender, the dual shocks, same engine, all that stuff. So basically you had the guy who was, a casual rider. You'll see in this ad for the XR where he's riding out there with his kids on their XR80 and XR100. And this XR200 would have been for that guy. And then you had the guy the quote-unquote enduro racer who could go to this new XR200. Now the 200, it continued to use the engine as a stressed member on the frame, meaning that the motor itself was part of the frame structure. I always thought that was a strange design on a racing machine. I'm not sure if there was any reliability issues, but in any case, these early XRs used that design. There was a new fork. The forks on this XR200R are 35 millimeter forks, so they're significantly larger than what you would have found on the original XR200. Still had the weird little headlight with the light on top. I always thought that was a strange design. Never, even back then when I was a kid, when I had this bike, I thought that was an ugly design. I don't know why that was popular, but maybe they thought it, I guess, put it up higher. But in any case, I thought it was a weird look. Now, the XR200 does have a plastic tank, where the original XR had a metal tank. The engine is painted black, but I think it's the same basic engine. Other than, it says here in the brochure they made some minor improvements to the close ratio transmission, but I'm not sure exactly what they changed. There is more travel. The rear suspension now has 9.7 inches of travel in the back. That's up over 2 inches from 1980. And the front has 9.8 inches, which is a little over an inch more in the front as well. So the forks are both larger in diameter, less flex prone, and they offer more travel. Still very simple forks. They're simple damper rod style. There's no adjustment for compression or rebound, nothing like that. And I think actually the rear ProLink does offer adjustable rebound, if I remember right. So there is some adjustment built into this, but again, very trick. Linkage, this is really at the cutting edge of motocross suspension at the time in terms of overall design, if not components. And this Honda claimed a dry weight of only 222 pounds. Now, that is one interesting thing to say about these XRs. You think of four-strokes as being very heavy, but these original XR200s and what have you, they're actually pretty lightweight. They are heavier than like an IT200 would have been, or actually an IT175 at this point. So obviously, but they're still not like massive heavyweight bikes. If you ride them, they don't feel like tanks or anything by any means. So in 1981, you could get your two flavors if you were serious about trying to race a four-stroke in the 200 class. As crazy as that might have seemed at the time, you get this XR200R with its racy CR styling. Look, I mean, just in terms of looks, the difference between these two bikes is like night and day. One looks like it was, designed 10 years before the other one. So definitely an improvement in terms of appearance and certainly performance as well. For 1982, both the XR200 and XR200R were back with a list of fairly minor updates. The regular 200 did get a new set of air adjustable forks. Now what that means is these were not air forks per se in the way you think of a modern air fork. These were still spring forks, but in the 70s and early 80s, people used air as an assist, meaning that if you wanted to stiffen the forks up a little bit without actually putting a different set of springs in there, you could pump a little pressure into the forks. I did this on a few machines over the years. It really wasn't a great solution, but it did offer a little bit of adjustability, certainly more than you had. So if you're having it bottom out really bad, you could put a little air in each fork. So that was one update for 82. They also changed the side plates from black to white, which gives it a fresh appearance. Now for 82, the 200R, which was considered the quote-unquote competition model, did get a new rear shock with, as the brochure says, CR-type damping. I'm not sure how much this thing damped like a CR. My experience with XRs is they do not damp anything like a CR, but that said, that's what the brochure said. They also added a lighter remote reservoir to reduce weight. They improved the front fork springs and added new damping. They also added new rims, front and rear, lighter. They were considered to be lighter and stronger according to the brochure. They have new tires for 1982. I assume this means the death for all time of the claw action tire, although I'm not sure if they ditched that in 81. But in any case, it says new tires for 82. They have new rim locks to go with the new wheels, and they redesigned the chain guide slightly to add a slider for longer wear. Other than that, the 82 is identical to the 1981. All right, for 1983, the XR200 and XR200R are back with mainly just cosmetic updates. Both machines are mechanically identical to 1982. They didn't change anything as far as the engine, suspension, drivetrain, none of that stuff. Honda had an all-new 200R on tap for 1984, so I guess they stood pat in 83. Now, the 200, the standard lower-cost model, does have all-new bodywork, and it really does freshen the appearance quite a bit. This is the first year in 1983 Honda went to the flash red, which is more of an orangey red, as opposed to the dark, like kind of blood red of 82. And adding the all-new bodywork in that color definitely freshens the appearance. You'll notice as well, the XR gets an all-new tank. It gets all new side plates with a much more modern kind of style appearance. They got rid of the droopy wet noodle and needed some Viagra rear fender of the 82 model in favor of a much more, straight out, more modern looking rear fender. Looks like the front fender is the same design, but it is an updated color. So really the bodywork definitely makes this bike look a lot better, a lot more modern. Now on the 200R side, as I said, the bodywork is all new, only in color. It's the exact same bodywork they had in 1982, but it does have the orangey red, and in my opinion makes the bike look like 500% better. Although that's a purely up for debate. Some people like the more black and red look of 82 and 81, but I love this orangey red. It was always my favorite. Maybe because this is the era I kind of grew up really getting into moto, so these are kind of always my favorites. The 85 through 83 here is definitely my favorite era for Honda colors in general on the XRs. For 1984, Honda had some major changes on tap for their XR200R. The XR200R was all new from the ground up. It was a complete redesign. The XR200 did continue to be in the lineup with only some cosmetic updates. It got the new blue seat. Other than that, it's identical to the 83 model. Again, the updated graphics and bodywork definitely helped the looks, but the old-fashioned dual shocks clearly kind of signaled that this was more of the play bike. For 1984, what Honda tried to do was reposition the 200R as even a more serious race alternative. And it kind of did a weird thing for the XR, where it put it in this weird, not fast enough for experts, but now too complicated and fairly difficult to ride for novices. What they did was they took instead of having a completely different frame for the 250 and the 200 this year, they took the 250 chassis, which was all new in 1984 as well, and put a smaller version of that motor in the 200. Now that meant it got the all-new radial 4-valve combustion head. That moved the XR200 from a simple 2-valve design to a more complicated 4-valve head. Now the radial 4-valve combustion chamber, it was designed to provide more power, had a very narrow angle valve train, and it was supposed to make the engine a little easier breathing, give it more high RPM power. Now, none of these XRs were screamers in the modern sense. Certainly nothing like a YZ250F or something. If you rode one of these now, even one of these XR motors with the 4-valve head, you're not going to have much in common with a modern 4-stroke. But compared to the 2-valve version, it was not as torquey, more of a high revving power plant. When they went to the more sophisticated power plant, they also added the dual carburetor setup that was found on the XR350 in 1983 and 500. And this, again, was designed to give it a wider power band, where you'd have one carb come in at low RPMs and then a second carb come in at higher RPMs, give it a wider pull. In reality, it kind of made the bike just difficult to tune. It was easy to get these things out of whack, and most people just weren't real happy with this setup. The 250 was already not a powerhouse. 4-strokes in general, they do real well when they have a lot of displacement. They're a little harder to make power at in the lower displacement range. And this 200, it gained 9 pounds in the transition and a great deal more complexity. This was still a wet sump engine, meaning it carried all the oil inside the motor. And this first version of this engine tended to run very hot. They had issues where it would cook the oil, where you'd float the valves. The engine would get so hot, the springs would sack out, and it would you could roach the valves. There were a lot of reliability issues with this very first rendition of this 4-valve head. It was a little better in like the 500, but this 200, you really put a lot of tax on the motor, wringing its guts out. And I think most people actually prefer the old engine, even though this one did have 2 more horsepower on the dyno. When Dirt Rider tested it, it put out 2 more horsepower is nothing to sneeze at, but when you're giving up a lot of other things to get it, I think most people weren't real happy with it. Now the chassis was much more aggressive for 1984. It had a very steep steering angle, short wheelbase, handled very well in the trees. It was very nimble as far as that goes. These are great woods bikes in terms of the handling. The forks did get a little bit larger for 84. It went from a 35 millimeter to a 36 millimeter fork. They're still very simple though. They're damper rod style forks. No adjustment externally other than just air pressure. Nothing fancy. Even by 1984 standards, these are small forks. 36 millimeters are tiny actually. On a CR that year, you're seeing 43 millimeter forks on the motocross version. So it definitely is, not the state of the art in terms of suspension. Continued to use a Pro Link shock with a steel swing arm. It looks aluminum, but it's not just painted silver. There are lots of little changes in the motor from the 250. The carbs are smaller. The clutch is a little different. It uses rubber bushings instead of springs in the clutch. Also, the 250 has a more sophisticated, a larger fork with disc brakes, and the 200 had to make do with drums. Although, most people didn't consider the drum to be a major problem. This thing wasn't made for bombing across, Baja or something in the woods. They worked fine enough. Overall, I think this bike, it looks a lot better. I love this new bodywork. It's a very handsome motorcycle. This is kind of, when I think of a mid-80s XR, that's kind of what it looks like. It's a good looking bike. They finally redesigned the headlight. This headlight is like 8,000,000% better looking than the older design with the headlight at the top, which I couldn't stand. Also, the front fender now no longer is pointing at the moon all day long, which was just comical on the old one. In spite of this being a much more quote-unquote serious machine, I think it just didn't fit in. I mean, the XR200 was never going to have the power of like an IT200 or some of the more powerful 2-strokes at that displacement level, at least with 1984 technology. And what you've done is just made an expensive, underpowered XR250 essentially. And I just don't think this bike was, even though it was technologically more advanced, I just don't think it was really a massive hit. It seemed to mostly confuse people at the time as to what the real target market was for this new XR200. For 1985, purely visual changes on tap for the XR200R. Really love the looks of this bike. The change to the red, white, and blue Honda wing, which is by far my favorite, is iconic. This was a great looking motorcycle. The 85 XRs and CRs look basically the same. They moved to the blue fork boot from the black, and also had the little blue Pro Link on the rear swing arm. Other than that, mechanically the same, but this is a handsome little bike for sure. And as I said earlier, this is my favorite era for Honda, and this 85 XR actually is my favorite of the XRs. Although I will say the all-new XR600 and XR350 this year with the new bodywork are a little more handsome than this machine, but they added new side plates and a different style tank. But overall, good looking little motorcycle. Still kind of in a weird in-between thing where most people weren't real sure what to make of it, but handsome motorcycle nonetheless. All right, for 1986, we have reached what most people would consider the heyday for the XR200. There are XR200 aficionados out there, believe it or not, and most of them would tell you this 86 through 88 model is the high watermark for the XR in most every way. Now, for 86, what they did was Honda looked at their sales the previous 2 years, and actually reading a little bit about this model, apparently the old 2-valve motor was actually more popular with its consumers, and they realized that they liked the handling and the more sophisticated suspension, bodywork, and what have you of the XR200R, but did not like the finicky and slightly problematic new 4-valve engine. So for 86, what Honda did was take the parts that were loved about both models and meld them into one bike. They took the old 2-valve engine that was found on the original XR200 and the 200R prior to 1984 and put it in the newer style chassis. Now the bike looks more different than it probably is because of the radical change in bodywork coloring in 86. For some reason, the CRs kept the orange and blue kind of look, and the XRs went a different direction. They went with the white fenders, white side plates, and what have you. It definitely gives this bike a totally different appearance, the white frame. I think it's cool. It's definitely iconic. I still kind of prefer the normal orange look, but in general, it definitely freshens up the appearance. This bike, other than color, is the exact same bodywork. The frame, the suspension, bodywork, all of that is the same as 1985 with the exception of a few minor changes needed to mount in the new engine. This new XR200 engine is the old 2-valve model. It's not as powerful, as I said. It makes about 2 horsepower less than the R model, but it has a much stronger torque curve down low. It's more reliable. Didn't have the overheating issues and valve failure issues that the 4-valve engine had. Just in general, it's a bulletproof, rugged design. And you got to figure this model, as much as Honda always tried to make it into some kind of a, quote-unquote legitimate racer, it was never going to run with, the smaller displacement 2-strokes. It just didn't have the power for that. It was not made really for that. If you were going to try and do it, you're going to run the bejabbers out of it and then probably cause the valves to have a problem. So Honda looked at their core customer who wanted the more modern chassis and put the older motor in it and basically got the Goldilocks version of the XR200. This is a great machine. It has, linkage on it, an adjustable shock, decent quality suspension. Again, not as good as what you found on the 250, but overall for the kind of, if you ride one of these now, it's very soft. Obviously, it's going to bottom out and everything. But as a trail bike machine, bike for your girlfriend to ride or just to have a little fun in the woods, it was a great machine. And I think by most standards, like I said, this is probably is the high water mark for the XR200, at least in terms of performance overall. For 1987, the XR was back with only graphical updates, and those graphical updates are very minor. You'll notice the font on the seat and tank is different. Personally, I kind of prefer the 86 to the 87, but both are, they're almost the exact same. It's not much in the way of difference in looks. Also, personally, I hate the fact that they got rid of the iconic Honda wing on the tank. I was always a fan of the Honda wings on there, and it kind of sucks that neither one of these have that on there. It's kind of weird, too, because the CRs kept them. I never quite understood how come the CRs kept it and the XR just went a totally different direction, but most years the two were kind of in lockstep in terms of the overall appearance, and starting in 86, the XRs kind of blazed their own trail there for a few years. For 1988, the XR was back with, again, only minor graphical updates, no mechanical updates at all in these years. The 88 does get a change from blue to red for the front fork boots, and also a change in the fender from white to red in the back. Other than that, they're exactly the same. Personally, I don't really love this change. I think it looked better with the white fender, but again, who cares? You're splitting hairs. Who cares? Not a real big difference. Also not a giant fan of this 88. This 88 design is actually probably my least favorite in terms of the graphical design. I'm not sure what they went with that font on the XR and the tank. It's not great. It would look better if they just went with the Honda wing and put a little XR below it like they did on the CRs. But enough droning on about the wing. Now, this is interesting to note that the 88 is probably the high watermark in terms of XRs, 200s, because this is the last year where it had the front and rear lights and also the tool bag on the back. After this, Honda would actually take a year off in 1989. There was no 1989 XR200. They didn't make one that year. I think part of the problem was in 88, there was a big spike in the late 80s there at the price of the yen, the cost of the yen versus the dollar. and all the models were going up significantly. Honda's their motocross machines famously went up like $1,000, which is when you go from 3,000 to 4,000, that's a huge difference. A lot different than it is, going from 95 to 10,000 or something today. So when this XR200 came out in 1986, it retailed for $1,698. And 2 years later, in 1988, the retail price was all the way up to $2,598. That's almost, what is that, like an 80% increase or something? It's pretty insane. So the fact that Honda was feeling the pinch in terms of the exchange rate, I think it probably had a lot to do with it. They probably had a fair amount of these XRs sitting in showrooms too, and the price went up so massively. I could imagine there probably were a fair amount of these things still sitting around in showrooms at the time in 1988. So for 89, they did not make any of the XR200s. It was a leftover model for that year. After a year off, the XR200 was back in Honda's lineup for 1990 with a fresh appearance and a fair amount of decontenting. If you look at the machine, it has no front number plate. I'm sorry, no front headlight anymore. They replaced it with a front number plate. There's also no tool bag on the back, and there also is no tail light. Now, one good thing about this is it allowed Honda to put a lower retail price on the 1990 XR. For 1990, it retailed for $2,398, which is $200 less than it was in 1988, 2 years before. So the bike is a little bit less expensive. It is also a little bit lighter. It came in at 225 pounds on dirt bike scale, which actually was only a half pound lighter than a CR250. So these bikes, again, they're obviously not a huge performance envelope on them, but they are light. They weren't heavyweight machines. They're fun and easy to flick around and whatever. It's why I love riding them. They're super fun. The motor, chassis, everything else is the same as it was in 88. The suspension is still the best that the XRs would ever have in the 200 class. They were the 36mm air adjustable leading axle forks. They put out 10 inches of travel, although there was no adjustment for compression or rebound. In the rear, it has a ProLink shock with 16 compression adjustments and 4 rebound adjustments, and put out 9.6 inches of travel. And again, this is the highest quality components that the XR would get. The nice thing about these units in these years is they're actually rebuildable. Later models would have a much lower grade of shock that is not designed to be rebuilt. And actually, I understand that these forks actually do really well if you run with Racetech cartridge emulators, which I had in my 83 480. They made a huge difference. And I actually understand that Racetech can actually get this suspension working pretty well. For 1991, the XR was back with only cosmetic updates. The tank is white. This is the first year for the white tank. Not a big fan of this appearance in general. I think it looks a lot better with the red tank, but whatever. I mean, that's a minor thing. Other than that, it's exactly the same. You'll notice the fork boots are like a purpley bluish color, whatever color. I'm not sure what you'd call this, built into the graphics and the side plates and what have you. Again, not generally my favorite color combo. As a side note, this is the last year to use the full-size suspension components, so if you are searching for an XR200 and you have any intention of doing anything with it other than just letting your girlfriend ride it, this would probably be the last one you'd want to buy. After 1991, Honda took the 92 season off. There was no XR200 in 92. But for 93, it was back, and unfortunately, quite changed. Obviously, the motor, the chassis, all that stayed the same, but they revamped the suspension components to lower the bike a full 1.5 inches. You can see here, if you look side by side between the 91 and the 93, it's pretty dramatic how much shorter the suspension is. Now, much like was done with the original XR75/XR80, I think at some point Honda realized that people weren't actually going to race these things. They weren't anything more than just kind of play bikes. And maybe they figured their target demo was more, young riders, girlfriends, what have you. So they thought the bike would be better served by having shorter suspension. Now, unfortunately, the suspension is not just shorter, it's actually less sophisticated as well. The front forks are still 36mm, but they only have 8.2 inches of travel for 1993. That's almost 2 inches less travel than it had the year before, so that's a pretty significant difference. The ProLink rear suspension has 8.3 inches of travel, down from 9.6 inches in 1991. So again, pretty significant difference. But it's not just that. It's also this new shock is a much lower quality shock. It does not have any external adjustments for rebound or compression. At least the earlier ones, yeah, they weren't what you would have found on a CR, but they at least had some adjustability built into them. They were higher grade. You could rebuild them, what have you. This thing here is designed to be not messed with. It's for somebody who doesn't think anything about, performance as far as that goes. It's going to be just ride it like it is or get an aftermarket shock. So going forward after 1993, all of these XRs have this lowered suspension, lower quality suspension. So depending on what you're looking for, maybe that was a good move. Again, if you're a shorter rider, or like somebody with had a little trouble reaching the ground, it wasn't like the standard XR200 was a skyscraper to begin with. But if you were shorter, like I said, this would have been better. Certainly would have been shorter than like a KDX 200 or something like that. So it was more of a beginner bike. I think I read somewhere this thing only sits like an inch higher than like a CRF 100 or something did. So it was much smaller machine overall. Basically short machine with full size ergonomics. So I guess that was the target demo they were going for. They realized that maybe that was going to be a an easier sell. I'm not sure. I'm sure they looked at some sales numbers to make that decision, but for me personally, it kind of sucks because I was already too big for this thing to begin with. So one of these like this would probably definitely struggle with my substantial girth. Starting in 1994, unfortunately, there really is nothing more to talk about for the XR200 in terms of actual mechanical changes or improvements. It's just a bold new graphics every year. I will say I do like this 94 in terms of the graphics changes they made. The darker blue is a little better. Actually, I do prefer that to the 93 design. 94, I think it gets even more purple. The purple started to become all the rage in the 90s, as you know. If you look at the CRs, they're purple in 1995 as well. And that purple kind of makes its way to the XRs here in the side plate and also in the graphics and the fork boots. I do actually think this is not a bad look overall. I think of all these, I like the 96 the best. This was the first year they came out with the all-new 96 XR250 and XR400. And the styling on those, I like the graphics quite a bit. If you're going to have an XR on the tank, not a wing, this is probably my favorite design they used in the 90s. And this 96 bike was good looking. The purple with the red, it's funny, I didn't think it worked that well on the CR. I thought it was kind of weird. But somehow this XR, maybe because the bodywork's all white, then it's not, somehow the ratio is a little different, but whatever, it's a little better look in my opinion. Now in 97, we went to the black. As you can see, all of a sudden purple was the rage and then it wasn't. It's kind of weird. Somebody woke up and decided, you know what, purple's out, we're going with black. So starting in 1997 here, you get the black. I prefer the 96 to this personally, but it's splitting hairs. It's not a big a difference, honestly. The basic machine, again, is completely the same. I will say that the lack of a number plate background makes the bike look kind of different, kind of looks unfinished. The 98 model brings back the Honda wing on the tank, which I do like. The 97 and 98 were good-looking CRs that year, and this XR is not bad. Again, the black is, it's an overall good look, but the little splash of yellow here with the on the graphics itself matches the yellow spring and stuff. It's an okay-looking bike overall. 99, didn't like the 99 that much. I had a 99 CR. I didn't really care for the graphics on the 99 here. They got rid of the wing, although I'm sorry, the wing is kind of built into the logo itself. If you look, it's kind of a almost like a strobe, like Yamaha does with their strobe on the tank. But I just didn't care for it as much. It's not my favorite. But starting in 2000, this is when things start getting much more interesting in terms of the appearance, I think. I like this move to go back to the all red look, get rid of the white side plates, kind of mimicking the look of the new CRs this year. This was the first year for the all new CR250 and CR125. And I think I prefer the 2001 look a little bit. As you can see, the graphics are a little bit different for 2001. Again, mimicking what you would have found on the CRs. Overall, though, I like the fact that it's all red and just the white side plates kind of freshen the look and make this bike look newer than it really is. I mean, this bodywork is essentially a 1985. This 2001 and 2002 XR is 1985 bodywork. The only difference is the suspension a little shorter. So they really didn't change any of the plastic or anything in all those years. It just looks like chop-legged now. Now we've come to 2002 here. This is the last year for the XR200. May she rest in peace. Good little motorcycle. Had one hell of a run. This was a very, very popular play bike for many, many years. I'm sure there's still thousands and thousands of them running around. Again, if I was gonna, I do know that from doing a little research that you could swap out some of the XR250 suspension for this thing. Some of the earlier XR250 front ends will fit on there. So if you wanted to upgrade the forks and get a little bit longer travel, I'm not sure what you'd have to do with the shock, whether you'd have to go with like a Works Performance or something if you wanted to get the shock back up to speed. But I mean, who's going to spend all that time and money on a bike like this? Probably nobody with the right mind. Now, while the XR200 was retired at the end of 2002, it did live on, at least in spirit, in the all-new 2003 CRF230F, a machine that added a little more displacement and also conveniences like electric start, a front disc brake. Suspension has a little more travel, and you can see the styling is a quantum leap forward, certainly way more in line with what you would have saw with the CRs at the time. Got rid of that 1985 look, which had become pretty stale by the time 2002 ran around. This machine, I've never actually ridden one of these. I don't know if it's much different in terms of the actual performance. I imagine it probably has a little more power, but of course the bike probably weighs more too. So I'm sure that probably sets it off. Yeah, it looks like 238. So maybe it's like 12, 15 pounds more. You got a battery and electric start and what have you. In any case, the XRs, they were great machines for a long time. And I'm glad to see that Honda at least kept a machine kind of like that in its lineup going forward. So there you have it. That's a look back at the XR200R and its many iterations over the years. A machine I think that a lot of people think fondly of, loving it even today. Great little bikes. Like I said, mine, I learned a lot on it, had a great time with it. I had some issues with it. It was pretty beat when I bought it already. It was probably 5 or 6 years old. And on a dirt bike like that, that's like dog years. So it's more like 20 years old by the time I got it. It was pretty tired. It ended up starting to shift itself. The shift internal mechanisms were a little bit squirrely. What's funny is I didn't know anything back then, and I actually was racing around with it. It would downshift itself, and I think about how dangerous that was. The transmission was ready to explode at any point. It finally did go bang, but man, I literally rode that thing into the ground. It was it was fun while it lasted. So I'd love to pick up another one just to have to play around with. They're good bikes. I think it lives on in spirit with the current CRF lineup. I don't know that they quite embody the same ethos that the original XRs did, but it's nice that there are still some inexpensive little four strokes you can ride around and have a good time with. So bikes like this, they're awesome. This is from an era when four strokes were considered fun machines. They weren't race bikes, so I guess maybe I always think of them more fondly. The two strokes were for racing, and the four strokes were for fun, and obviously that paradigm has shifted now. So in any case, if you'd like to support the channel, if you could like, subscribe, comment, I would very much appreciate that. Again, leave me any suggestions on other videos you'd like to see in the future. I hope to do one maybe on the PE Suzukis as well, one on the RMX lineup. I love off-road machines. Like I said, I always end up riding maybe 50-50 off-road motocross, and I love them both. And pretty much anything off-road I'm a huge fan of, ATVs, what have you. I'm agnostic as far as that goes. Motocross is my number one seed, but I dig all the other stuff as well. So in any case, thank you for watching this. This is Tony Blazer. Until we meet again, keep the rubber side down. Peace.